Della Hargis was 64 years old, standing in a dead man's lawyer's office, listening to her husband's family laugh at the only thing he left her. A tin-roofed house on Crow Ridge Road that nobody wanted. Not the savings, not the good truck, not the 12 acres on the valley side where the soil was soft and the county kept the road paved. Just the house on the hill, the one with the slanted porch, and the well that sometimes ran dry in August. And every person in that room thought it was a punishment. But Arlen Hargis had never punished his wife for anything in 41 years of marriage. He wasn't about to start from the grave. If this story feels like something you needed to hear today, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. We bring you stories like this one every week, stories about people who were underestimated, who were counted out, and who turned out to be the only ones paying attention. The office of Gerald Whitcomb, attorney at law, sat above the hardware store on Main Street in Briar Hollow, West Virginia. Second floor, one window. The kind of office where the radiator clanked all winter, and the carpet had been the same shade of brown since 1987. Della had been here once before 3 years ago when Arlen updated his will. She remembered sitting in the same wooden chair, her purse on her lap, while Arlen signed papers and made a joke about leaving everything to the dog. Mr. Whitcomb had laughed. Della had smiled. She hadn't asked what was in the will because she trusted the man who wrote it. She had always trusted the man who wrote it. Now that man was 4 months in the ground, and the chair across from her was empty, and the room was full of people who had not visited him once during the 11 weeks it took the cancer to finish what it started. Wade Hargis sat closest to the desk. Arlen's younger brother, 58, thick hands, a face that looked like it had been carved from the same Appalachian rock as the hills outside, but with none of the patience that rock had earned over millennia. He wore a canvas jacket with the Crockett Side Services logo on the breast pocket, though. Della wasn't sure whether he worked for them officially or just wanted people to think he did. His wife Charlene sat beside him, legs crossed, fingernails tapping the arm of her chair, in a rhythm that suggested she had somewhere more important to be. And behind them, both leaning against the wall with his phone in his hand, was Bryce Wade's son, 30 years old, the kind of young man who called his uncle's widow Miss Della to her face, and that woman when he thought she couldn't hear. Mr. Whitcomb read the will. It did not take long. The savings account, what was left of it after medical bills, went to a fund for the Briar Hollow Volunteer Fire Department. Arlen had been a volunteer there for 22 years. The good truck, the 2011 Ford with the toolbox bed, went to Wade. The valley acreage went into a trust for community use, which meant nobody could sell it, and nobody could build on it, and nobody was going to get rich from it. And the house on Crow Ridge Road, along with the 17 acres surrounding it, and all structures, water rights, access rights, and timber rights attached to the deed, went to Della Hargis, his wife. Bryce laughed first. Not loud, just a short exhale through his nose. The kind of sound a man makes when he thinks he's been proven right about something. Charlene followed, though hers was more controlled. A tight smile, a glance at Wade, a shake of her head that said exactly what she thought without requiring a single word. Wade said nothing. Della noticed that. She noticed it the way she had noticed things for 41 years of marriage to a quiet man, not by what was said, but by what was held back. Wade's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to Mr. Whitcomb's desk where the deed lay in its manila folder. His fingers pressed flat against his thighs. He was not laughing. He was not smiling. And when Mr. Whitcomb read the phrase, all access rights, water rights, and timber rights attached thereto, Wade's left hand curled into something that was almost a fist before he caught himself and flattened it again. Everyone else in the room heard a joke. Wade heard something else entirely. Charlene leaned forward. So she gets the shack. She didn't say it to Della. She said it to Mr. Whitcomb as though Della were not in the room, as though 64-year-old women became invisible the moment their husbands stopped breathing. That place hasn't been worth $20,000 since the roof started leaking. It's a burden, Gerald. Arlen should have known better. Mr. Whitcomb adjusted his glasses and said nothing. He had known Arlen Hargis for 30 years. He knew exactly what Arlen knew. Bryce pushed off the wall. We'd be willing to take it off her hands, save her the trouble. 25,000 fair and square. He said it like he was doing her a favor, like he was picking up a stray dog from the road and giving it a warm place to sleep. Della looked at him. She looked at Charlene. She looked at Wade, who still had not spoken, whose eyes were still on the manila folder, whose silence was louder than every word his wife and son had said combined. "No, thank you," Della said. 3 words. No explanation. No trembling. No speech about how the house meant something to her, about how Arlen's memory lived in those walls, about how she would sooner die than sell. She did not owe them a story. She had spent 41 years learning how to say what needed saying and nothing more. And this was one of those times where less was the only amount that mattered. They filed out. Bryce's first phone already at his ear. Charlene next heel sharp on the wooden stairs. Wade last pausing at the door just long enough to look back not at Della, but at the desk where the folder sat. Then he was gone too, and the room was quiet and the radiator clanged twice like it was clearing its throat. Mr. Whitcomb waited until the front door downstairs closed. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a second envelope. This one was older, yellow-brown, the edges soft with age. Arlen's handwriting across the front in pencil, the way he always wrote, as though ink was a commitment he wasn't ready to make until he was sure of the words. "He asked me to give you this separately," Mr. Whitcomb said, after the others left. Della took the envelope. It weighed almost nothing. Her name was written in the center, Della May. Not her married name, not Mrs. Hargis. The name he had called her the first time they danced at the Elkins County Fair in 1979 when she was 23 and he was 25, and neither of them knew that the song would last 41 years. He said you should open it when you reach the house. She put the envelope in her purse. She did not open it in the car. She did not open it at the gas station where she stopped for fuel and a bottle of water. She did not open it on the 40-minute drive from Briar Hollow up into the hills, where the paved road turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to dirt, and the dirt turned into something that was more memory than road. She waited because Arlen had asked her to wait, and she had spent 4 decades learning that when Arlen Hargis asked you to do something a certain way, there was a reason even if you didn't see it yet. Crow Ridge Road was not a road in the way that most people understood the word. It was a scar in the hillside that someone had driven over enough times for the earth to give up and flatten. It climbed for a quarter mile through hickory and oak, past a rusted cattle gate that hadn't held cattle in 20 years, over a creek bed that ran dry in July and flooded in March, and ended at a clearing where the sky opened up and the Allegheny ridgeline stretched out in both directions, like the spine of something ancient that had lain down to rest and never gotten up. The house sat in the middle of that clearing. 1 story. Tin roof green once now the color of moss and weather. A porch that leaned 2 degrees to the left, as though the house had been listening for something down the valley for so long that it had started to tilt in that direction. 2 windows in front, 1 cracked. A chimney that still worked if you knew how to open the flue without getting a face full of soot. A kitchen door in back that swelled shut in summer and rattled loose in winter. Della parked beside the old walnut tree, the one Arlen had hung a tire swing from, when his nephew was small, before Wade stopped bringing his family up the hill, before the distance between the brothers became the kind of thing nobody talked about because everybody knew. She sat in the car for a long moment. The engine ticked as it cooled. A crow called from somewhere in the timber. The air smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet and wood smoke that had been gone for months. She got out. She walked to the front door. The key was brass-heavy old. It turned with the kind of resistance that meant the lock still worked, but resented being asked. The door opened into a room that smelled like dust and closed windows, and the particular kind of silence that only exists in a house where someone used to live and doesn't anymore. The kitchen was through the doorway on the left. Della saw it before she saw anything else. Not the stove with its 1 broken burner, Not the table with its 3 chairs, there had been 4 once, but the fourth broke years ago and Arlen used the wood to patch the porch railing. Not the window over the sink where the light came in gold in the mornings and made everything look more hopeful than it probably was. She saw the mug. It sat on the counter beside the sink, exactly where it had been the last morning. Arlen drove down to the valley for his appointment at the VA clinic, the appointment where the doctor said the word that changed every appointment after it. A blue ceramic mug with a chip on the rim the size of a thumbprint. Della had bought it at a church rummage sale 11 years ago for 50 cents. It was nothing. A factory second glazed unevenly, the handle slightly too small for a man's hand. But Arlen had used it every single morning from the day she brought it home to the day he couldn't hold it anymore. He drank his coffee black from that chipped blue mug while the sun came up over the ridge, and he never once reached for another one. And Della had never once asked him why. She picked it up now. It was lighter than she remembered, dust in the bottom, a faint ring of old coffee like a watermark. She held it with both hands the way you hold something that has outlived the person who gave it meaning. And she stood in that kitchen and breathed. A voice came back to her. Not a memory exactly, more like the impression a voice leaves in a room it filled for decades. Arlen, sitting at this table, coffee in this mug, looking out that window. A house remembers who showed up. He'd said it one morning after Wade cancelled another visit. Della had thought he meant the building. The walls, the floor, the door that had been opened and closed 10,000 times. Now standing alone in his kitchen with his cup in her hands, she was not sure he'd meant the building at all. She set the mug down gently. Then she opened her purse and took out the yellow envelope. Inside were 2 things. The first was a small key brass newer than the house key wrapped in a strip of masking tape with 2 words in Arlen's pencil, "Feed shed." The second was a piece of lined paper torn from the kind of yellow legal pad that Arlen bought in packs of 3 from the dollar store. One sentence written in the careful block letters of a man who knew his handwriting was hard to read and wanted this particular message to be clear. If they laughed at the house, they never understood the land. Della read it twice. She read it a third time. She folded the paper and put it in her shirt pocket next to her heart, which was a thing she would never have done if anyone were watching, but which felt like the only right place for it now that she was alone. She went out the back door and crossed the yard to the feed shed. It was a small structure, maybe 8 by 10, with a padlock on the door. The padlock was old, but when Della looked closer, she saw something that made her stop. Scratches around the keyhole. Fresh ones. Bright metal showing through where the surface had been scored, as though someone had tried to pry it open recently and failed. She looked down. Boot prints in the dried mud near the threshold. Large, a man's. Not Arlen's. Arlen had been too sick to walk out here for the last 3 months of his life, and these prints were sharp-edged, recent, made after the last rain. She used the small key. The padlock opened on the first try. Inside the shed smelled like motor oil and cedar. Arlen's workbench ran along one wall, still holding his hand tools, each one hanging from its own nail in the order he preferred. But against the back wall, behind a stack of feed bags that hadn't held feed in years, there was something Della had never seen before. A steel cabinet painted the same faded blue as the mug in the kitchen, bolted to the floor. It had a combination lock, and on the lock a strip of tape with numbers in Arlen's hand. She dialed the combination. The cabinet opened. Inside were folders, 7 of them, Manila, labeled in Arlen's block letters with dates and descriptions. The first was marked 1978 Survey Original. The second, 1983 Easement Recorded. The third, 1991 Water Rights Spring Confirmed. On through the years, each folder a chapter in a history of this land that Della had never been told, because Arlen had never been a man who talked about things before they needed talking about. The last folder was different. It was newer. The manila was clean uncreased, and the label did not have a date. It had a name. Della May. She opened it with hands that were steady because Della Hargis had survived 41 years of marriage. to a man who expressed love through preparation rather than words. And she knew that whatever was inside this folder was not an accident. It was a message. Arlen had written it for the moment she was standing in right now, alone in his shed with his family's laughter still ringing in her ears and a house that everyone said was worthless sitting 30 feet away. 3 pages of lined paper. His handwriting looser than the note in the envelope, as though he had been tired when he wrote this but unwilling to stop. The first page was practical descriptions of the easement, the spring, the timber. The second page was a list of names and phone numbers. Roy Phelps, surveyor, retired. Marcy Bell, County Records Office. The third page was personal. She read slowly. The land under this house is worth more than what sits on top of it. And I don't mean that as an insult to the house. The access road that runs from the county line through our east boundary to the ridgetop has been a recorded easement since 1978. That means anyone who wants to reach the timber stands on the north slope has to cross our property to get there. The spring that feeds the creek below the Walnut Grove is a confirmed natural water source, and the rights are attached to our deed, not the county's, not Wade's, not anyone's. The walnut trees on the upper acre are black walnut old growth, and they are worth more standing than most people's houses. Wade knows all of this. He has known since our father died in 1994 and left this parcel to me because I was the one who stayed. I'm telling you now because I will not be here to tell you when it matters. And it will matter because Wade has been waiting for this land since before I got sick. And he will come to you with a number that sounds like generosity but is built on the assumption that you do not know what you own. Do not sell this land to Wade. Do not sell it to anyone until you understand what it is. And then the line that made her close her eyes and press the paper against her chest. Blood is easy to claim. Showing up is harder. And below that in smaller letters, as though he had added it later, perhaps on a different day, perhaps on a day when he was thinking about his brother more than usual. If Wade comes asking about the road, do not believe he just got curious. Della stood in the shed for a long time. The light through the single dusty window was turning amber. A bird sang outside, one of those late afternoon songs that sounds like a question nobody answers. She held Arlen's letter and understood for the first time since the funeral that her husband had not left her a burden. He had not left her a shack on a hill that nobody wanted. He had left her a fortress, and he had left her the map. And he had done it in the only way Arlen Hargis knew how, quietly, carefully, with the faith that she would find it when she needed it, and not a moment before. She was putting the folders back into the cabinet when her phone buzzed. A number she recognized. Charlene. The voice on the other end was warm in the particular way that voices become warm when they want something. Della, honey, I just wanted to check in, make sure you're settling in okay up there. That road can be a trial when the weather turns. A pause, then casually, as though it had just occurred to her. Has anyone talked to you about the access road yet? The one that goes up past the east fence. Della felt something shift in her chest. Not surprised, something colder. Charlene had not said a road. She had said the access road. She had specified past the east fence. She knew its location. She knew its name. And she was asking about it within hours of the will reading, before Della had even finished unpacking her car. I just got here, Della said. I haven't had time to look at much. Oh, of course, of course. Well, you know, if you need anything, we're just down in the valley, Wade was saying, and this is just him being practical, you know how he is. He was saying that $25,000 really is a fair price for that property, all things considered. The roof alone is going to cost you. And winter up there. Della, winter is no place for a woman on her own. Della looked at the steel cabinet, at the folder with her name, at the letter that told her exactly what Charlene was doing and exactly why. I appreciate the call, Della said, and she hung up. She walked back to the house. The light was low. The porch creaked under her feet in 3 places she counted. Inside, she turned on the kitchen light, and the mug on the counter caught the glow and held it blue and chipped and still there, The way some things just refuse to be discarded, no matter how many reasons the world gives them. She filled it with water from the tap. The water ran brown for 10 seconds, then clear. She drank from the side without the chip the way Arlen always had, and she leaned against the counter and looked out the window at the ridge going dark. Wade had not been surprised in that office. He had not laughed at the house. He had been silent because he knew what the house sat on, and he had been afraid not of the will, but of the possibility that someone might have told Della what the land was worth before he could get to her with his $25,000 kindness. Arlen had seen it coming. From the hospital bed, from the hospice chair, from wherever the dying go when they start to think about what they're leaving behind and who will try to take it. Arlen had seen his brother's patience and recognized it for what it was. Not grief, not family loyalty, strategy. And he had done the only thing a quiet man could do. He had written it down. He had locked it in a cabinet. And he had trusted his wife to find it. Outside, a truck engine idled somewhere on the road below the property. Della went to the front window. Through the trees, maybe 200 yards down Crow Ridge Road, she could see taillights. A vehicle parked at the old cattle gate, just sitting there with the engine running. Not coming up, not leaving, just watching. She pulled the curtain closed. She checked the back door. She checked the front. She pulled Arlen's letter from her pocket and read the last line one more time. If Wade comes asking about the road, do not believe he just got curious. Then she set the letter on the kitchen table beside the chipped blue mug in the house that everyone said was worthless on the land that turned out to be the most valuable thing a quiet man ever owned. And she did not sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, because she was beginning to understand. The county records office opened at 8:30 on weekdays, and Della was standing at the door at 8:22. She had driven down from Crow Ridge in the dark, following the road by memory more than headlights, because the road was not the kind that forgave hesitation. And she had spent the night memorizing Arlen's folders until the names and dates sat in her mind, like furniture in a room she could walk through with her eyes closed. Easement, 1978, recorded. She didn't know what half of it meant, but she knew where to start because Arlen had written a name on the second page of his letter, and that name was Marcy Bell. The office occupied the ground floor of the Greenlee County Courthouse, a limestone building with a copper dome that had turned green 50 years ago, and a front door that still stuck in humid weather. Della pushed through it and found a room that smelled like old paper and toner cartridges, and the particular institutional quiet of a place where things are filed and forgotten and filed again. Metal shelving ran floor to ceiling along every wall. A counter separated the public side from the records side, and behind that counter sat a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a chain and a stack of plat maps open in front of her. Help you. I am looking for an easement record, filed in 1978. Property on Crow Ridge Road, parcel number. Della pulled the folder from her bag and read the number of the label carefully digit by digit the way Arlen had written it. She felt foolish. She had spent 30 years working the front desk at the Briar Hollow Branch Library, checking out books and helping patrons find what they needed. And now she was on the other side of the counter needing help. She didn't fully understand asking questions. She wasn't sure she was asking correctly. Marcy Bell looked at the number. Then she looked at Della. Something moved behind her eyes recognition, or something adjacent to it. Hargis property. Yes. Give me a minute. Marcy disappeared into the shelving. Della heard drawers open and close, pages turning, the squeak of a rolling ladder on its track. Through the high windows, morning light fell in columns onto the linoleum floor, and Della stood in one of those columns and waited, her hands gripping the strap of her purse, the way she had gripped the armrest of the chair in Mr. Whitcomb's office. Not because she was afraid, but because holding something steady made the rest of her feel steadier too. Marcy returned with a file folder and a rolled plat map. She spread the map on the counter and pointed with the eraser end of a pencil. This is your parcel. These lines here, that's the easement. Recorded April 14th, 1978 by Arlen Hargis, your husband's father. It grants right of access along this corridor. The pencil traced a line from the county road through the eastern edge of the property climbing north toward the ridgetop to anyone with documented need to reach the parcel beyond. That means timber companies, utility crews, anyone doing business on the north slope. Della studied the map. The line ran directly through her land. Without it, the parcels above were landlocked, accessible only by helicopter or a 5-mile detour on logging roads that washed out every spring. Has anyone come in asking about this recently? Marcy hesitated. It was a small hesitation, the kind most people would have missed. But Della had spent a career reading the small pauses of people who were deciding how much to say. I can't discuss other people's inquiries, but I can tell you that this file was pulled twice in the last 6 months, before today. Twice. While Arlen was dying. Someone had come to this counter, asked for this folder, and studied this map while Della was sitting beside a hospital bed counting the spaces between breaths. She thanked Marcy. She made copies 50 cents a page fed into the machine herself because Marcy was busy with another patron and Della did not want to wait. The copies came out warm and smelling like static. She put them in her bag beside Arlen's originals and she walked out into the morning air. And she stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the parking lot and saw 3 rows back a truck she recognized. Dark green, mud on the wheel wells. The same taillights she had seen idling at her gate the night before. She walked to her car without looking at the truck again. She drove out of the lot at normal speed. She did not call the sheriff because she had nothing to report. A parked truck was not a crime. But she noted the plate number on the back of a gas receipt and put it in her glove box because Arlen had taught her that you don't wait until you need evidence to start collecting it. 3 days passed. Della spent them the way she had spent most of her life, methodically, without drama, one task at a time. She cleaned the kitchen, she bleached the bathroom. She hauled dead mice from the pantry and scrubbed the shelves with vinegar until the smell was something she could live beside. She taped plastic over the cracked front window and swept the porch and discovered that the lean was not structural, but cosmetic. One of the support posts had sunk into soft ground. She could fix that. Not today, but eventually. She did not call anyone. She did not ask for help. This was not pride. It was habit, the kind that forms in women who learn early that asking is a currency with a limited supply, and you save it for the things that can't be done alone. On the 4th morning, a car she didn't recognize pulled up to the gate. A tan sedan, old but clean. The door opened, and a woman got out carrying a casserole dish covered in foil. Tall, white-haired. A face that had been handsome 40 years ago and had aged into something better. A face that looked like it had made every important decision at least twice and regretted the right ones. Lottie Kincaid. Della knew the name, but not the woman, not well. They had exchanged waves across fence lines and said hello at the post office and once shared a pew at the Briar Hollow Methodist Church when every other seat was taken. Arlen had mentioned her occasionally. Lottie's got more sense than half the county commission. But they had never sat down together, never shared a meal, never had the kind of conversation that lasts longer than the time it takes to pay for stamps. "Brought you a chicken bake," Lottie said, handing over the dish. "I would have come sooner, but I didn't want to crowd you. Some people need space after a loss, and I figured you for one of them." Della took the dish. It was warm through the foil. "Thank you." Lottie did not leave. She stood on the porch and looked out at the clearing, at the walnut grove on the slope above the house, at the tree line where the timber thickened into second-growth hardwood. "I want to tell you something, and you can decide if it's my business or not. I've been seeing a truck parked down by your gate. Green late model. Sits there 10-15 minutes at a time, usually around dusk. I walk my dog past that stretch most evenings, and I started noticing about 2 weeks after the funeral. 2 weeks after, before the will reading, before Della even knew the house was hers. How often? 4 times, maybe 5. I wrote down the dates. Lottie reached into her jacket and handed over a folded piece of notebook paper. Dates, times, brief descriptions. 4:40 p.m. green truck, engine running. 5:15 p.m. same truck, someone walking, tree line with flashlight. The handwriting was small and precise, the record-keeping of a woman who had learned a long time ago that memory alone was not admissible. "There's a man you should talk to," Lottie said. "Roy Phelps, retired surveyor, lives out on Quarry Road. He did the original survey work on half the properties in this end of the county, and he owes me a favor from 1996 that he knows I haven't forgotten." Della called Roy that afternoon. He came the next morning, a lean man in his early 70s with sun-darkened skin and the deliberate walk of someone whose knees had opinions about hills, but whose stubbornness overruled them. He wore a canvas hat and carried a walking stick that Della suspected was more tool than crutch. He shook her hand at the gate and said, "Lottie says you've got a land question. Let's walk." They walked the east boundary first. Roy moved through the underbrush with the slow certainty of a man reading a language written on the ground. He found the old road, or rather, he found what was left of it. Beneath a decade of leaf litter and creeping ground cover, the roadbed was still there. Compacted gravel, a drainage ditch on the downhill side, even the ghost of tire ruts from trucks that had used it 20-30 years ago. He poked his walking stick into the soil every few feet and nodded. "This is your easement corridor, still intact under the surface. Hasn't been maintained, but hasn't been legally abandoned either. Anyone who tells you it expired is either lying or doesn't know the law." They walked higher. Near the property's northeast corner, where the walnut trees grew thick and old, Roy stopped. He crouched down slow and brushed dead leaves off a wooden stake driven into the ground. The top was rotted, but the base was still solid, and when he scraped the dirt away, Della could see numbers carved into the side. 78, Roy said. "Original survey marker. Your father-in-law put these in when he filed the easement." He stood and looked up into the canopy. Then his expression changed. On the trunk of the nearest walnut, a tree wide enough that Della could not have reached her arms around it, a strip of bright blue flagging tape was tied at chest height. Fresh. The color was vivid, unweathered. It had not been there long. Roy walked to the next tree. Another strip, the next, another. 12 trees in a row, each one marked with new blue tape. Each one a black walnut worth somewhere between $8,000 and $15,000 standing. "Someone's been marking your timber," Roy said. His voice had changed. The conversational warmth was gone. What remained was the flat, precise tone of a man who had spent his career drawing lines on paper and understood what it meant when someone crossed them. "These marks are fresh. Last few weeks at most. And whoever did it didn't have your permission because you didn't know they were here." Della looked at the blue strips fluttering in the breeze. 12 trees, 12 flags, 12 decisions made by someone who had walked onto her land without asking and begun cataloging what they intended to take. "Is this legal?" "Marking's not illegal by itself. Cutting without the landowner's consent is. But you mark before you cut, and nobody marks trees they're not planning to come back for." A voice came from downhill, high-thin, startling in the quiet. "Are you the lady who lives in the tin roof house?" Della turned. A girl stood at the edge of the tree line, half behind a hickory trunk, as though she had been watching them, and was only now certain enough to speak. Small, 10, maybe 11. Brown hair pulled back in a ponytail that was coming loose. Muddy sneakers. A jacket too big for her with the sleeves rolled up twice. "I'm Wren," the girl said. "I live down past the creek. I come through here sometimes. The fence has a gap." Roy looked at Della. Della looked at Wren. The girl did not seem frightened. She seemed like a child who was used to being outside, used to the woods, used to walking through other people's land, because the land had never objected before. "There was a man up here," Wren said. "Last week. He had an orange vest and one of those wheel things you push on the ground to measure stuff." he was putting the blue ribbons on the trees. Did you see his face? No, but he drove a green truck. Della brought Wren inside. Not because she had planned to, not because she had thought about mentoring a child or building a bridge to the next generation, but because the girl was thirsty and the afternoon was warm and the most natural thing in the world was to pour a glass of milk and hand it to a 10-year-old who had been wandering the woods alone. She reached for a glass, then stopped. She reached instead for the mug on the counter. The chipped blue one, the one that had held Arlen's coffee every morning. The one that had no business being used for a child's milk, except that it was clean and it was close, and something in Della's chest said this was right. Wren wrapped both hands around it. Her fingers were small and dirty, and they fit the mug differently than Arlen's had his hands had been wide-scarred, the hands of a man who built things. Wren's were the hands of a child who climbed things. Different grip, same cup. Della watched her drink and felt the weight of time shift in a way she could not have explained and did not try to. Do you come through here a lot? Most days, after school when the weather's okay. Sometimes I sit by the spring and read. She said it like it was obvious, like every child spent their afternoons beside hidden springs on dead men's land. The spring. The one below the big rocks, where the water comes out of the hill. It's cold even in summer. My mom says the water's cleaner than what comes out of our tap. Della added this to the architecture she was building in her mind. The easement, the timber, and now the spring, not a well, not a pipe, but a natural source running clean, the kind of water right that attached to a deed like a signature that could not be forged. 2 days later, Wade came. He drove up Crow Ridge Road in the middle of the afternoon, unannounced, his truck kicking gravel into the ditch. Della was on the porch replacing the screws in the railing, a small repair, pointless maybe, but the kind of work that gave her hands something to do while her mind turned over larger problems. She heard the engine and set down the drill and waited. Wade got out slowly. He had brought nothing, no casserole, no offer of help. His hands were in his jacket pockets, and his face wore the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say, but hadn't decided on the opening line. "Just checking on you," he said. Charlene was worried. He walked toward the porch. Della stayed where she was, standing above him on the second step, which gave her 2 inches of height she didn't usually have, and which she did not relinquish by stepping down. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was the same silence that had been in the lawyer's office, the silence of a man who was calculating. "Place looks better than I expected," he said. He glanced at the yard, the walnut grove, the ridgeline above. His eyes moved the way a buyer's eyes move, not seeing beauty, seeing inventory. "You know, Della, this is a lot of land for one person, a lot of responsibility. Arlen always talked about how much work it was just keeping the road passable. Arlen managed. Arlen was a man." The words sat in the air between them. Wade did not seem to realize what he had said, or if he did not think it required correction. Della let the silence hold. She had learned a long time ago that some sentences condemn themselves if you gave them enough room. She looked at his boots. She had not planned to. Her eyes simply dropped the way eyes sometimes do when the face in front of you is saying one thing and the truth is somewhere lower. His boots were work boots, leather mud on the soles, and on the left boot, caught in the tread just above the heel, was a short strip of blue material, bright blue, unmistakable, the same shade, the same synthetic fabric, the same flagging tape that was tied to 12 walnut trees on her upper acre. Wade had been on her land. Wade had been marking her trees. Wade, who stood at the bottom of her porch steps talking about responsibility and what a woman couldn't handle, had walked through her timber with tape in his pocket and plans in his head and the quiet confidence of a man who believed she would never look down. She did not say anything about the tape. She did not point or accuse or ask him to explain. She looked at it and she looked away. And she filed it in the same place she had filed Charlene's phone call and the truck at the gate, and the scratches on the shed padlock in the part of her mind that Arlen had trusted, the part that collected pieces and waited for the picture to complete itself. "I appreciate you coming by," she said. Wade left. Della watched his truck descend the road until the tree swallowed it. Then she went inside and added a line to the notebook she had started keeping on the kitchen table. Wade blue tape on left boot, same as tree markers. Date, time, weather. The way Lottie had taught her without meaning to by example, by handing over a folded piece of paper with dates and times written small. That night, she lay in bed and listened to the house settle around her. The tin roof ticked as it cooled. A branch scraped the window on the west side, the one Arlen had always meant to trim and never did. In the dark, with her eyes open, she heard his voice again. Not the words at first, just the sound of it. The low rumble that had filled this bedroom for 41 years, and now filled nothing left. Nothing except the shape of itself in her memory, like a handprint in wet concrete that had long since dried. A house remembers who showed up. She understood it differently now, not as a statement about buildings, not even as a complaint about Wade's absence. It was a definition. Arlen had been defining something he could not say directly, because direct was not how he worked. He was saying that loyalty is not a word, it is a pattern. It is the person who shows up on the ordinary days. The days when there is nothing to gain and nothing to celebrate. And the only reason to walk through the door is that the person inside matters. The house remembers. The house keeps count. Wade had stopped showing up 20 years ago. Della had never stopped. 5 days later, 3 vehicles arrived at the bottom of Crow Ridge Road at the same time, which was not a coincidence and was not an accident, and was the kind of coordinated arrival that only happens when people have talked to each other beforehand and agreed on a strategy. Wade's truck was first. Behind it, Charlene's silver SUV, and behind that, a white pickup with a magnetic sign on the door, Crockett Site Services Land Management and Timber Solutions. A man Della had never seen stepped out of the white truck, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a company polo, and the kind of smile that existed entirely for the purpose of making the thing he was about to say sound reasonable. Calvin Sanner. He introduced himself at the gate with a handshake that was too firm and a business card that Della accepted because refusing it would have given him something to talk about. "Mrs. Hargis, I hope we're not catching you at a bad time. Wade mentioned you might be open to discussing options for the property." Della looked at Wade. Wade looked at the ground. "I didn't say that." "Well, we're here now." Charlene stepped forward, arms crossed. The posture of a woman who had decided how this conversation was going to end before it began. "And honestly, Della, this has gone on long enough. Arlen meant well, but he left you something you can't maintain. The roof needs replacing. The road washes out every spring. The taxes alone are going to eat you alive. We're offering to solve that problem." Calvin Sanner nodded along like a man listening to music he had written himself. "We've been looking at access routes to the North Slope timber stands. Your property sits right on the most efficient corridor. We are prepared to offer a long-term lease on the easement and a timber harvesting agreement that would take care of the walnut removal at no cost to you. You'd be compensated, of course." "How much?" "30,000 for the lease, plus a percentage of timber revenue." 30,000. 5,000 more than Bryce's offer at the will reading. As though the extra 5 were proof of generosity rather than proof of desperation. Della thought about Roy's estimate of the walnut trees, alone 12 trees at 8 to 15,000 each. She thought about the easement which gave her the power to grant or deny access to hundreds of acres of timber beyond her property line. She thought about the spring, which she had not yet had appraised, but which she suspected was worth more than every number anyone had said out loud in her presence since Arlen died. "I'll need to see that in writing," she said, "and I'll need my attorney to review it." Charlene's face tightened. "This is a family matter, Della. We don't need lawyers in the middle of..." "It stopped being a family matter when you brought a timber company to my gate. The silence that followed was different from the silences before. It was not the silence of calculation or strategy. It was the silence of three people realizing that the woman standing on the porch with a screwdriver still in her back pocket and sawdust on her jeans was not going to do what they had expected, was not going to fold, was not going to cry or thank them, or sign something on the hood of a truck. Della pulled out her phone. She dialed Mr. Whitcomb. She stepped inside and closed the screen door between herself and the three of them, and she spoke quietly while they stood in her yard looking at each other. And when she came back out, she said, "My attorney will be in touch. Until then, I'm not discussing this further. You're welcome to leave the way you came." Calvin Sanner smiled. Wade stared at the walnut grove. Charlene turned on her heel and walked to her SUV without another word. They left. And Della stood on her porch and realized her hands were shaking. Not during she had been carved from Crow Ridge limestone, steady and cold and immovable. But now after, with the sound of their engines fading down the hill, her body caught up to what her mind had done, and she sat down on the top step and pressed her palms flat against the wood and breathed until the shaking stopped. She had won something. She didn't know what to call it yet, but she had stood in her own yard and said no to three people who had expected yes. And the house behind her was still standing, and the land beneath her was still hers. And that was enough for today. It was not enough for the night that came 6 days later. The storm arrived from the west without the courtesy of a gradual approach. One moment the sky over the ridge was pewter. The next it was black, and the wind came through the hollow, like something that had been holding its breath for weeks and finally let go. Rain hit the tin roof so hard it sounded like gravel. The power went out at 7:14. Della knew the time because she was looking at the kitchen clock when it stopped, and the sudden silence of the refrigerator was louder than the thunder. She lit the kerosene lamp Arlen had kept on the shelf above the stove. She set pots under the three places where the roof leaked: the bedroom corner, the hallway near the bathroom, the spot above the kitchen table where the tin had buckled inward and never been fixed. The water came through in thin streams, steady, patient, as though the rain had found these weaknesses long ago and had simply been waiting for the right night to prove its point. She sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the sound of water hitting metal from three directions. The mug was in front of her. She had not put it there consciously. It lived on the counter, but at some point during the evening she had moved it to the table, and now it sat in the circle of lamplight like a small blue planet with a chip in its side. And she looked at it and felt the weight of everything she had been carrying settle onto her shoulders at once. The roof, the road, the taxes, the easement she barely understood, the timber she couldn't harvest alone, the spring she hadn't protected, the lawyer she couldn't afford for long, the truck at her gate, the tape on Wade's boot, the company man with his smile and his $30,000, the bed she slept in alone, the voice she would never hear in this kitchen again. She picked up her phone. Charlene's number was in her recent calls. Her thumb hovered over it. She could hear what she would say. "You were right. I can't do this alone. I'll take the money. Just make it stop." She could hear Charlene's voice on the other end, warm with victory, saying all the right things. "We'll take care of everything, honey. You won't have to worry." And she could see herself putting on her coat and driving down the hill one last time and never coming back. And the house would be empty again, and the mug would sit on the counter until someone threw it away, and the land would be logged and leased and sold, and Arlen's letter would be nothing but paper, and the story would end the way everyone had expected it to end, the moment Bryce laughed in that lawyer's office. Her thumb touched the screen. Then someone knocked on the door. Not pounded, knocked. Three firm raps evenly spaced the knock of a person who understood that startling a woman alone in a dark house during a storm was not the way to begin a conversation. Della opened the door. Lottie stood on the porch in a rain jacket that was soaked through a flashlight in one hand and a bundle of dry blankets wrapped in a garbage bag in the other. Water ran off the brim of her hat in a solid sheet. Behind her, The storm turned the hollow into something biblical rain so thick. The walnut trees were shadows, the ridge invisible. The world reduced to this porch and this doorway, and two women standing on either side of it. "Power's out across the whole ridge," Lottie said. "Figured you might not have enough blankets for a cold one like this." Della looked at her. She looked at the blankets. She looked at the flashlight that Lottie was pointing down away from Della's eyes. Because even in a storm, Lottie Kincaid had the manners to think about where her light was falling. "How did you get up here?" "Drove. Road's a mess, but the car's seen worse." Lottie paused. Rain hammered the porch roof. "Can I come in, or are you going to make me justify myself further in this weather?" Della stepped aside. Lottie came in, set the blankets on the counter, and turned off her flashlight because the kerosene lamp was enough. She looked at the pots on the floor catching water. She looked at the phone in Della's hand, still open to the recent call screen, and she did not ask who Della had been about to call, because she did not need to. She sat down across from Della at the kitchen table, the lamp between them, the mug between them, the sound of the storm everywhere around them, like the world reminding them both how small a house was and how large a night could be. "You don't have to hold this alone," Lottie said. Her voice was quiet, not gentle. Lottie was not a gentle woman, but her voice had the kind of steadiness that comes from having sat in dark kitchens before, in other storms with other women who were deciding whether to stay or go. "But you do have to hold it." Della set her phone face down on the table. She did not call Charlene. She did not call anyone. She sat in the lamplight with a woman she barely knew and listened to the storm. Tried to take apart the roof, and the roof held not because it was strong, but because it was still there. Still nailed down, still doing the only job it had ever been asked to do. And in the morning when the rain stopped and the light came through the kitchen window, the way it always did, gold. Unreasonable, offering more hope than the evidence supported. Della made coffee in the chipped blue mug and carried it to the porch and stood in the steam and the silence and looked at her land. The road was rutted. 2 branches had fallen across the path to the shed. The creek at the bottom of the hill was running brown and fast. But the house was standing, and she was standing. And somewhere below her, the spring was still feeding the creek, and the walnut trees were still marked with blue tape she hadn't put there. And the easement was still recorded in a courthouse file that had her name on it. And none of that had changed because of one storm, and none of it would change because of the next one. She went inside and deleted Charlene's number from her recent calls. Not from her phone, just from the list. Just from the place where her thumb could find it without thinking. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The morning after the storm, Della called Mr. Whitcomb before the coffee finished brewing. She told him everything. The truck at her gate, the blue tape on the trees, the dates Lottie had written down. The strip of flagging caught in Wade's boot tread. Calvin Sanna's offer, and the fact that the easement file at the county records office had been pulled twice in 6 months by someone who was not her. Mr. Whitcomb listened the way lawyers listen when the story is longer than the client realizes. Then he said, "Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything verbally. Don't meet with anyone alone. If they come back, you call me first, and you call me on speakerphone, so I'm a witness to whatever gets said. And Della, everything in writing from this point forward. Everything." She wrote the instructions on the back of an envelope and tacked it to the kitchen wall beside the light switch, where she would see it every time she walked in. It was not a strategy. It was a spine written in blue ink borrowed from a man she was paying $140 an hour to think clearly on her behalf. She spent the next 3 days preparing. She met with Roy again at his kitchen table on Quarry Road, where he spread her copies of the plat maps beside his original survey notes from 1978, and walked her through the boundaries line by line, corner by corner, teaching her to read the language of the land. The way someone might teach a person to read music, not the melody but the structure underneath it that holds the melody in place. She took notes in a spiral notebook. She asked questions. Some of them were good. Some of them revealed how much she didn't know. Roy answered all of them with the same even patience. And when she apologized for asking too many, he looked at her over his reading glasses and said, "The only people who should apologize for asking questions are the ones who already know the answers and are pretending they don't." She called Calvin Sana's office and requested in writing the full terms of Crockett's proposed lease. The woman who answered the phone sounded surprised, not that Della was asking, but that she was asking calmly with specific language using the word terms instead of deal and proposed instead of offered. The documents arrived by certified mail 4 days later. Mr. Whitcomb reviewed them and called Della the same evening. "They're lowballing you by a factor of 3 at minimum. The easement access alone is worth more than the entire lease they're proposing. And the timber clause gives them harvesting rights in perpetuity with no replanting obligation. You sign this, they clear-cut every walnut on your upper acre and leave you with stumps." Della sat at her kitchen table and read the contract again. She understood now what she had not understood in the lawyer's office on the day of the will reading, that the laughter had been intentional, that calling the house a burden was part of a strategy, that every expression of concern from Charlene and every casual mention of the access road and every appearance of Wade on her porch with his hands in his pockets had been a coordinated effort to make her feel small enough to sign something before she understood what she was signing. She did not feel small. She felt specific. She felt like a woman with a notebook full of survey data and a lawyer on retainer and a 72-year-old neighbor who wrote down license plate numbers for no reason other than that someone ought to. She proposed the walk. It was Mr. Whitcomb's idea, technically a boundary survey, with all parties present documented on the record. But Della was the one who set the date and the time and the meeting point, and she was the one who called Wade and told him to bring Calvin Saner and whoever else he wanted, because she was bringing Roy and Mr. Whitcomb, and there was no point in doing this twice. They met at the gate on a Thursday morning, October, the kind of Appalachian autumn day that smells like cold water and wood smoke, and the slow, patient decomposition of everything that grew in summer. The ridgeline above was copper and gold. The air had the clarity that only comes after a season's worth of rain has washed the haze out of the valley and left behind something clean and honest and slightly too bright. Wade and Charlene stood by their truck. Calvin waited beside the Crockett pickup with a folder under his arm. Bryce stood a few steps behind his parents, hands in his jacket pockets watching, but separate as though he had come because he was expected to, not because he had chosen to. On the other side of the gate, Roy unfolded his maps on the hood of his car, and Mr. Whitcomb opened his briefcase, and Lottie leaned against the fence post with her arms crossed. Present not because she had been invited, but because she had shown up, which on Crow Ridge Road had always been the more important qualification. Della stood at the front of the group. She had not planned this. She had intended to walk beside Roy to let him lead, to defer to his expertise, the way she had deferred to expertise her entire life at the library in her marriage, in every room where someone else seemed to know more than she did. But when the moment came when everyone was gathered, and the maps were spread, and the morning waited for someone to take the first step, Della stepped forward. She stepped forward because the land was hers, and the path was on her deed. And if anyone was going to lead a walk across Della Hargis's property, it was going to be Della Hargis. They walked the east boundary. Roy planted survey flags every 50 feet orange bright, visible from a distance driven into the ground, with the authority of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and did not require anyone's permission to be thorough. Each flag was a sentence in a story the land had been telling for decades. The old roadbed appeared beneath their feet, solid and undeniable, a path that had been used and then deliberately obscured, and then used again by someone who preferred not to be seen. Calvin walked behind Della, his company polo looking increasingly inadequate against the morning chill. He said nothing. He watched Roy work. He watched the flags go in one after another, marking a corridor that was wider and more established than anything his lease proposal had acknowledged. And Della could see him recalculating not the numbers, but the assumptions behind the numbers. The story he had been told about a small parcel with a leaky house and a widow who didn't understand what she had. They reached the upper acre. The blue tape was still on the walnut trees. Roy pointed it out without commentary, photographing each one, noting the GPS coordinates in his logbook. Calvin looked at Wade. Wade looked at the ground. Then Roy found something none of them expected. Past the last line of marked walnuts behind the feed shed, in a thicket of serviceberry and young oak that had grown up since the last survey, Roy stopped. He crouched. He brushed away leaves and debris from the base of a wooden post, old hand-hewn, barely visible above the soil line. He checked his maps. He checked his GPS. He stood up slowly, the way a man stands when he has just read a sentence that changes the meaning of the paragraph before it. "This is the northwest corner marker," he said. "Original 1978 survey, and it's 43 feet further north than the current county plat shows." The silence was absolute. Even the birds stopped. "What does that mean?" Della asked, though she could see from Roy's face that it meant something significant, something that was going to rearrange the landscape of this conversation. The way the storm had rearranged the branches on her road. "It means the boundary was drawn wrong on the updated county map. Whoever transferred the plat data in the 90s moved this corner south. Your property extends 43 feet further than anyone has been calculating. That strip runs along the entire northern edge of your parcel." He traced the line on his map with his finger. "It includes the ridgetop access point, the spot where the easement corridor meets the county road above. Without that strip, the access route narrows to nothing. With it, you control the only practical entry to the north slope." Calvin Sana's smile had been gone for 20 minutes. Now his face was doing something more complicated. The slow recognition of a man who has built a business plan on a foundation that has just developed a crack. Wade spoke for the first time all morning. "That's a surveying error. It doesn't change anything." Roy looked at him. "It's not an error. It's the original marker driven by your father in the ground he knew. The error is on the county plat, and it changes everything." They continued walking. The group had reshuffled. Calvin was on his phone, speaking quietly, his back turned to the rest of them. Charlene had stopped making suggestions about what Della should do with the property. Mr. Whitcomb walked beside Della, saying nothing but writing notes in a legal pad with a pen that clicked once every time he uncapped it. It was Bryce who broke the silence. He had been quiet the entire walk, quieter than Della had ever known him. He was not looking at his phone. He was watching his father. He had watched Wade's face when the blue tape was photographed. He had watched Wade's face when the corner marker was found. And something in what he saw, some gap between the story his father had told him and the story the ground was telling everyone, had opened a question that he could not close. "Dad." Bryce stopped walking. Everyone else stopped with him because his voice had a weight it had never carried before, the weight of a son who has realized that the question he is about to ask will change his relationship with the answer forever. "Were you going to buy it from her before she found out what it was worth?" Wade turned. The two of them stood 10 feet apart on the old roadbed, father and son, the trees above them still wearing their fraudulent blue ribbons, the survey flags marking a boundary that was larger than the lie. Wade did not answer. The silence lasted long enough for the wind to move through the walnut canopy and for a single leaf to detach and fall between them, with the slow turning patience of something that has been holding on all season and has finally decided to let go. It landed on the roadbed. Nobody looked at it, but everybody felt it. Bryce nodded once. Not in agreement, in understanding. The kind of nod a man gives when he has received an answer he didn't want from a silence he can't unhear. He walked back down the trail toward the cars. He did not say goodbye to Della. He did not say anything else to his father. He just walked, and the sound of his boots on the old roadbed was steady and deliberate and final. Della did not watch him go. She was looking at Wade, and Wade was looking at the space where his son had been. and for the first time since the will reading, she felt something for him that was not anger and not contempt, but something closer to the ache you feel when you see someone lose a thing they didn't know they were risking. She reached into her jacket pocket. She had brought the letter, the third page, the personal page, the one Arlen had written in his loosening handwriting during the months when his body was leaving and his mind was staying, and he was trying to say everything that mattered before the distance between the two became permanent. She did not read the whole page. She read one line, and she read it out loud, and she read it in the voice she used when she was at the library reading to children during story hour. Clear, unhurried, the voice of a woman who understood that some sentences need air around them to do their work. The land is yours because you will think before you sell. You always did. Wade looked at her. His face did something she had never seen it do. It moved through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise, then recognition. Then something that might have been shame, though. Della could not be sure because she had never seen shame on Wade Hargis's face before and did not have a reference point. Charlene pressed her lips together until they disappeared. Calvin Sanner put his phone in his pocket and stood very still. Nobody spoke. Below them, invisible but audible, the spring fed the creek, and the creek ran down the hill, and the sound of it was the only sound in the world. For a long moment, water doing what water has always done, moving forward, finding the lowest path, needing nothing from anyone to continue. Della folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. She had said enough. Arlen had said enough. The land had said enough. There was nothing left to argue because the argument had ended, not with a verdict but with a fact. And the fact was standing in work boots on a porch that leaned 2 degrees to the left, holding a letter from a dead man who had loved her well enough to prepare for the worst, and quiet enough to never make her feel like he was doing it. The resolution took 3 weeks. Mr. Whitcomb drafted the terms. Della approved them. She did not sell the land. She did not lease the easement in perpetuity. She granted controlled access, seasonal, limited, revocable, with compensation tied to market rates that Mr. Whitcomb had researched and Roy had verified, and that bore no resemblance to any number Wade or Calvin had ever spoken out loud. She sold 6 walnut trees, 6, not 12, chosen by a forester. She hired herself, and the revenue was enough to replace the roof, reinforce the porch, install a new lock on the gate, and still leave a sum in the bank that would have made Bryce's $25,000 offer look like pocket change at a church rummage sale. The spring she protected outright. She filed the water rights with the county and posted the boundaries with survey markers that Roy helped her place on a Saturday morning when the fog was still in the valley, and the only witnesses were 2 crows and a 10-year-old girl who had come through the gap in the fence to watch. The house was not beautiful when the work was done. It was not the kind of house that would appear in a magazine or attract admiration from people driving past if people ever drove past, which they generally did not. But the roof no longer leaked. The porch stood level. The windows were whole. The door opened without resistance and closed without complaint. It was a house that worked, which is a different thing from a house that impresses, and Della had lived long enough to know which one she needed. Charlene came back once in November, alone. No Wade, no Bryce, no company man with a smile and a magnetic sign on his truck. She drove up Crow Ridge Road on a Tuesday afternoon, when the trees were bare and the sky was the color of pewter, and the valley below was visible for the first time since spring through the gaps in the timber. She stood on the new porch. Della stood in the doorway. I misjudged things. It was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was a statement of fact delivered in the voice of a woman who had spent 3 weeks with a husband who no longer made eye contact with his own son and who had been forced to reconsider the architecture of decisions she had endorsed without examining. Della looked at her. She felt nothing dramatic. No surge of vindication. No warmth of reconciliation, no desire to embrace or to punish. She felt the way you feel when someone finally says the thing you already knew they would say, in the room you already knew they would say it, in wearing the face you already knew they would wear. Yes, Della said. You did. Charlene left. Della closed the door, and that was enough. That was exactly enough. Spring came to Crow Ridge the way it always came, slowly, unevenly. The dogwoods blooming a week before the redbuds, the creek running cold and clear from snowmelt nobody remembered falling. The spring below the walnut grove pushed water up through the rocks in a steady pulse that had not changed in Della's lifetime, and would not change in the lifetime of anyone she would ever meet. On an afternoon in early April, Della sat on her porch in a chair she had bought at a yard sale in Briar Hollow for $12. The chair was wooden painted green, slightly too wide for one person, which made it comfortable in the way that things designed for company are comfortable even when you're alone. The sun was low enough to reach under the porch roof and warm her hands, which were wrapped around a mug, blue ceramic chipped on the rim filled with coffee she had made strong, because that was how Arlen liked it. And she had discovered in the months since his death that it was how she liked it too. She had never known that. 41 years of making coffee for someone else, and she had never once made a cup just for herself and noticed what she preferred. It turned out she preferred it strong. It turned out there were things she was still learning about the woman who had been here all along. The steam rose from the chip in the rim the way it always did, curling once before the breeze took it. The mug was warm in her hands. It was cracked and imperfect, and it held what she put into it. And that was all it had ever been asked to do, and it had never failed. A sound from the tree-lined feet on dry leaves, fast and light. Wren came through the gap in the fence at a run, backpack bouncing, one sneaker untied. She saw Della and waved without slowing down, and Della raised the mug in return, and the girl cut across the yard toward the spring, the way she always did, following a path she had worn into the grass by walking it so many times that the earth had simply agreed. Below the house the creek ran. Above it the walnut trees stood 6 fewer than before, but the ones that remained were old and wide and patient. And they would be here long after every person in this story had become a name on a deed that someone else would one day have to read. The road was visible from the porch now. Not the county road, the old one, the easement road, the one that had been buried under decades of neglect and deliberate forgetting. Roy's survey flags had been replaced with proper markers. The roadbed had been graded by a crew Della hired, with timber money. It was passable now, functional, honest, a road that admitted it existed, that no longer hid beneath leaves and silence, that led from somewhere to somewhere, and did not apologize for the ground it covered. Della drank her coffee. The light moved across the ridge the way it did every evening. Gold first, then amber, then the deep rose that lasted only a few minutes before the hollow filled with shadow, and the first stars appeared over the tree line. She did not think about Wade. She did not think about Charlene or Calvin Sanner, or the lease terms filed at the courthouse or the bank balance that would carry her through next winter and the winter after that. She thought about a man who sat in this chair on mornings she could no longer count, drinking from this mug, looking at this view, knowing what the land was worth and what his wife was worth, and trusting that the two would find each other when the time came. A house remembers who showed up. She had shown up. Every morning for 41 years, and every morning since, and tomorrow morning, and the morning after that. Not because the house needed her, because she had finally understood that she was not the person waiting to be welcomed. She was the one who made it home. The creek ran on, the spring fed it, the light faded, and somewhere down the hill, in the gap in the fence where the wire had been bent back so many times, it stayed open on its own. A child's footprints led in both directions, coming and going, going and coming, the way paths do when they belong to someone who intends to keep using them. If you stayed until the end of this story, I think you already know why. We all have something in our lives that other people underestimated. Maybe a house, maybe a skill, maybe just ourselves. Tell me in the comments, do you think Della was right to keep the land? And if you've ever held on to something everyone told you to let go of. I'd love to hear that story too. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.